Chapter 17. Oh, Canada. An old-school digital alarm clock from the late 20th century began wailing at 5:30 in the morning. But David had already been laying in the cot next to Ashley awake for the last 10 minutes or so. Ever since his body had been invaded with the electric current from the broken PowerPlant pylon, the images that came from his near-death experience followed him into his sleep. Sometimes his mind would play tricks with the images. The one thing that kept occurring in these lucid dreams was the vision of his father's face, or the face he imagined him to have, on the body of the man in the robes. Always, telling David his answers were up. David realized 2 nights ago, after the conversation in the inventory room, that had to mean at the NP1 power plant, all the way up in the North Pole. Ashley moaned as she turned away from the screeching alarm, and David reached over to hit the snooze button on the side of the old machine. He took time to look at her face while after pressing the 5-minute snooze button. The bump just under her hairline from the rifle butt that collided with her head was going down some. It required 2 stitches from Dr. Stevens. The bruising around the bump had in the last 2 days toned down some as well, and he was happy to see her recovering. He got out of the cot in the inventory room and made his way to the private bathroom. They had been given an old-school 1990s something electrical razor to shave with. It seemed Trace had already used it as David looked into the sink to see red hairs littered on all sides of the basin. He looked up at his own face. The scruff that had begun to grow the first week they hid in Nex's charge station, in STL, had started to come into what might be called a beard. The problem with calling it a beard was David's facial hair never grew evenly and had patches that really only resulted in goatee and long sideburns. The bruise marks on his neck were still very visible. Both Brick and the SDT agent Madsen had wrapped their hands around his neck in the span of 2 days, and as a result, left his voice a tad hoarse and his neck riddled with dark marks. The shiner he got from the first day he escaped at his office with Ashley had finally disappeared, although both his eyes had developed some bags. He also took note of his body as he stood there without a shirt on. His left hand was still wrapped in a cast, and he thought about Dr. Stevens' warning of needing surgery sooner than later. The pain in his hand was becoming a common discomfort for him, and the best way he found to deal with it when it got too unbearable was to take the painkillers he was left with. Although he tried his best to avoid them, he also noticed the bruise on the side of his right ribs had started to lighten in color. Another treat from Agent Madsen on the first day, while his chest had a deep bruise square in the middle from the riot shotgun's rubber bullet that was fired at him from a very close range. Had he not been wearing the bulletproof vest, a shot like that, even from a rubber bullet, would have killed him. He had been spitting up blood after that, but Dr. Stevens let him know he should be fine in the long run. David sighed as he reached for the shaver and turned it on. It felt good to clean up his face, even though he couldn't make it a close shave. Slight stubble was better than the wiry mess that was building on his face. As he was trimming down his face, he heard the alarm go off again. Ashley didn't move to turn it off immediately, and he heard Trace yell from his cot to, "Turn the damn thing off!" After a second or so, it went off. David made his way to the back smoking room. Since everyone in this building at any given time was a wanted fugitive, it wouldn't do the old Nex here any good to let people smoke in the parking lot. So she created a room for them to go and enjoy a smoke or two. He went back towards the cot to grab his smokes and his father's journal. He was reading the section right before his father stopped writing, to learn about his attempt at hitting a power plant. As he approached the cot, he saw that Ashley was sitting up, but was not fully awake yet. He left her alone to go through her waking rituals, grabbed his things, and made his way to the smoke room. Once inside the small little room, he quickly realized that his reading would have to be put on hold. Brick and Dee were in there, and Dee had waved at him. There was only one table in the room, and no matter what, he would have to sit next to them, which he knew would result in a conversation about his power plant hit. He sat down beside Brick, across from Dee, and pulled a cigarette out to light. "How you feeling today, Nash?" asked Dee. David shrugged as he lit his cigarette. "Oh, you know it hurts to breathe, and I still cough up a little bit of blood, but overall I can't complain," he said. He watched as Brick took a hit from a vape and watched him blow a big cloud of smoke into the air. He always thought it was strange that Brick, this giant freak of a man, also was someone who vaped. But it was the least important mystery to unravel at this point in his life. He leaned in towards Dee. "Still not wanting to come along with us?" he asked. She looked at him with that hard face of hers. Yes, still a no from me. I already agreed to a big hit job that pays well. For one, once I agree to a gig, I don't back out, and for two, this one pays and pays well. That's not common in this line of work, she said. Dee had not been part of that conversation that took place 2 days ago when David entered the room. The reason for this was she was in the room when Ashley and Trace first started to consider the job. She told them all flat out she couldn't tag along. Another, more financially opportunistic job presented itself to her prior to the DOE gig, and she took it. From what David was able to piece together, it involved an actual assassination. The rest was difficult to get out of her. He leaned back as he took a puff of his smoke. The pain from taking inhaling was unwelcomed. The damage to his chest from the shot left him in a delicate state, but he needed the nicotine fix. "So have you heard anything from your guy up north at least?" he asked her. Although Dee wasn't going to take part in the job, she had contacts in the Canadian border that could help them get along to the places they needed to, so they could reach NP1. Yeah, still ironing out a few details with him, and he has a few moving pieces on his end he needs to get lined up. But he should be giving me a call some point soon with the green light, she replied. David considered this while he took another drag. Awesome. Thanks again, Dee. It would be better to have you with us, but your connection is still better than nothing, David said. She nodded. This is a big lift, Nash. What you want to do, no one has come close to. It's going to take a lot of convincing and a lot of shadow deals. Some people in the organization would sooner sell out and run than try to hit a plant. But Dolph is good for it. He just needs time to get things in motion. Dolph was the name of this guy in Canada that Dee was going to connect them with. The only thing David really knew about the guy was that Dee said he was reliable. Brick leaned in. You know, even if we get popped, the filming and streaming idea, like at DOE, is smart. The world will see what we see, even in the end. David loved Brick's sunny optimism when they were discussing the PowerPlant job, which was often. This meant that they had to listen to Brick talk about certain death a considerable amount of time. In truth, David liked to hope they could get in and out alive. For one, he liked the idea of seeing what they film being shown to the world. He also wanted to be with Ashley in a less chaotic environment. All the running around trying to stay alive and uncover the truth was fun and all, but he missed watching movies with her snuggled on the couch without any real cares. He also wanted to find his way back to the Midwest Commonwealth and ask Nex the full story about his father's botched PowerPlant hit. He had been reading the entries leading up to the failed job in his father's journal and learned it was during a tough time. The section he had just finished the night prior explained it in his father's vague yet colorful detail. The Fed office job was a bust, a really bad one at that. We got ID'd in the process. Eddie, Vance, Jason, and myself, all over the news. It's hard, man. I was able to sneak out of the basement apartment for a few hours last night. I rushed home to see Joyce and play with David. He's only 3, but today in this world, he is reaching the age where they want to start pumping those drugs in him. It feels like nothing we do ever changes anything. I know it's got to have something to do with the PowerPlants. All these companies are connected somehow. Eddie and I are starting to think that if our faces and names are already over the news, maybe we should just go for broke. Nobody ever hit a PowerPlant successfully. We want to change that. Jason wants nothing to do with it, says we gotta lay low and fight another day. Vance is already gone, left the day after the botched job, and no one knows where he went. Jason doesn't get it, but when I look at my son, all I see is someone I love who will be forced to take those drugs and be another cog in their machine. I just can't let that happen. The section shed some light on the fracture of his father's team. They had been struggling as it was getting jobs done, and his father also highlighted in an earlier section that the UCA was going through a recession that was bordering on a depression. People within the organization were turning each other during jobs, opting, instead of being caught and reassigned, to be re-educated and stay with their families. Their faces and their last names were being splattered over the news of the day, pushing them further apart. It is funny what most will do when they realize the cost of the truth. Some step up and put it all on the lines while others look for a way to ensure self-preservation. Trace stumbled into the smoke area. Eyes searched for the crappy coffee that was in the room. His eyes were still covered in the residue of sleep in the corners. He was a sloppy human in general, David noted, but he was especially gross in the mornings. As Trace reached for the coffee and poured himself a cup of steaming black filth, he sluggishly moved towards the single table in the room. He took a sip of the sludge that passed as coffee and made a face as it went down. He looked up at David, and as he spoke, the air hung with the stench of his morning breath. "What's with the fucking alarm in the morning, man? Can't you just turn it off after you get up? Some of us like to sleep in." David's face grimaced in disgust from the smell of Trace's breath wafting across the room. "Ashley says she wants to wake up early too. You are the only person who wants to sleep late." Trace grinned at this. "Sleep late? You nutcases wake up early? I just want to sleep at least until 7. Then he looked over at Dee and Brick. "And these two? When do they even sleep? They are awake when I pass out and up when I roll out of bed," he continued. Brick looked at him with those dark, unnatural eyes. "I sleep, but I wouldn't be foolish enough to let someone know when and where." Brick said in his gravelly voice, "I typically get 3 hours. No need for more. I've never needed it," Dee said. David realized that Trace didn't quite understand the two people at the table with them. These two were killers more than anything, and that meant a level of distrust of the world around them. After all, an easy mark to kill is when it's a sleeping one. Trace, while having lived in this underworld and even having to resort at some point to killing someone, was not an actual killer naturally. Dee and Brick were. Trace looked back at David. "I'm guessing nothing has changed with the whole suicide mission?" he asked. David shook his head. "Still on, though I like to think of it more as a high-pressure team-building operation than a suicide mission," he joked. David understood Trace's thoughts on the job. He also worried about the possible result. But he tried to not let it sink in too deep. He wanted to pretend it would end in the best-case scenario for them. Trace made a sound like a snort and shook his head as he took another sip of his coffee. "Well, the first thing besides Dee's contact coming through is finding a way out of DC when everyone is looking for us," Trace mumbled. He was right. They had acquired quite a following in the last 2 days. Not just in DC, not even just the head of state Commonwealth area, but the entire dang country was buzzing about the terrorist attack on the Department of Energy. Using a multitude of techie mumbo-jumbo, Trace was able to get them keyed into a lot of media sites and news outlets, which David realized was the same damn thing at this point, but their faces, aliases, and in the cases of David and Ashley, their entire medical histories were available to the entire world now. When David stopped to think about it, he struggled to fully grasp the full situation. Everything about his and Ashley's lives were accessed and dumped out for the world to see. Not just he and Ashley, but David's father was on display as well. Highlights from the Talking Heads posse included lengthy exposés about if crime and terrorism could be hereditary. There was even conversations evaluating if companies like ChemFarm could find new experimental drugs for those who may be affected. They talked about how maybe tech giants like Census Tech and Arrowgate Solutions could create some possible identification device that could track genetic issues from infanthood before someone became a menace to society. Some representatives, always people with the nicest and most in-style outfits, came on for all companies, talking about how their respective entities were exploring those very options to ensure a better tomorrow. Ashley's past was also being explored. They were so shocked that a strong, young, intelligent woman who for so many years displayed all the characteristics of being chemically balanced suddenly jumped into a life of crime, all because some filthy, crime-prone man convinced her. They drew non-existent parallels between David and her former drunkard father, whom she was able to survive. This was annoying to David, of course, because he knew the truth. The truth was, Ashley was such a model of success because she was taking less Chembal than she was supposed to for years. He also knew she didn't escape her father. She took care of the failing man up until she was old enough to justify taking care of only herself. Most of all, he wasn't the one that had dragged her into this world. She had been tiptoeing the line for years, exploring the gray markets, being liberal with her dosage amounts. He was simply her catalyst to go further, as she was the same to him. He found it shocking that somehow, in the whirlwind of exposure, he was listed as the locked-in villain that hid in the shadows of a mild-mannered face for years. Trace, who had a thin official record, primarily because he spent most of his life off the grid, was a subject of curiosity. His name, Trace, was considered by the SDT, and as a result, by everyone else, to be a possible alias. David, of course, knew Trace's real backstory of being from a federal housing unit up to the age of 15, but even he wasn't sure if Trace was his actual name. They built this story in which Trace may or may not be calling the shots, that he clearly had experience in the realm of terrorism, but the experts believed the video footage of the trio was inconclusive as to if he was the shot caller. They felt firm in their hypothesis that either Trace or David were the leaders of the assault and needed to be captured or even killed. Both Brick and Dee were listed as unknown agents of terror. Brick, with his tattoos and massive frame, was a central conversation on several outlets about, is body modding ruining our youth? And cartel may be linked to terrorist activity against UCA? Should federal government clamp down hard on Mexican commonwealths? Besides the obvious facts that they could see, his tattoos marked him as possibly connected to the cartel, that he had performed clear-cut body modifications. They really had nothing else to go by. They had even less on Dee. In fact, she was so slim that they weren't even sure if it was a man or woman. At any rate, it didn't matter what they said about the five of them. The bottom line was at least Trace, Ashley, and David had become public enemy number one. The crazy part was, they had spent the last 2 days waiting for a drummer boy with the guts to take the intel they got from the DOE job and take it down to Nex in STL. Sure, they could just spread it from here, but this was a job created and put together by him, so he deserved to be the one to decide what happened with the information. To be honest, what they found behind the firewalls of the Department of Energy's data still made David angry and sick. The thing about EEDs, the reason no one ever spelt out the acronym, and why they had to literally break into a top-secret government office, was because it was extracting energy from humans. The PowerPlants, the pylons that connected the PowerPlants network grids to the electronic items that surrounded everyone in today's world, weren't nuclear-powered at all. It was powered by humans, the very people using them. Apparently, the sheer amount of energy that powered even the average person under the influence of the drug, Chembal, was so great they could power the entire grid of the world. Of course, as the secret reports also mentioned, if population stagnated too much, or if not, enough people were in radius of this tech, the draw on those around them spiked. This was a problem, of course, because although life expectancy had flatlined at 65, they wanted to avoid it possibly dropping even lower. They projected in one of the many documents they stole off the data wells that if the current population projections continued, even if they were able to get more tech in more rural and difficult-to-reach areas, the life expectancy could drop as much as 10 extra years. As the report said, while this may be an unwanted side effect, we also predict ChemFarm's Chembal drug should help negate most of the public's interest in the drop. What it all boiled down to was that a whopping 90% of the energy they were taking, as of right now, was being sent off to the top secret, mostly unheard of power plant referred to as NP1. The other 10% of energy was used to power the public. Whatever the elites of the world were doing with the other 90%, David had to find out. Dee's burner phone started to buzz, snapping David out of his deep thought. Yeah, it's live? Cool. When? Tonight, you know the joint? Good. Then they will see you on the other side, Dee said in quick, deadpan tones. She hung the phone up quickly and looked up at David and the others. Dolph has most the pieces lined up. He has even made contact with someone close to this way that is willing to be a transport to get you four there. He has a fifth that agreed to join along in place of me. I don't know who, though, she stated in her deadpan tone. As she was talking, Ashley had entered the smoke room. She didn't often like to come in here since it stank like permanent cigarette smoke, but she must have noticed everyone besides the old necks of DC was in here and came to join in possible big conversations, which had just begun. She sat down at the end of the table, facing everyone as the rest of the seats had been taken up by the other four. Judging by everyone except for Brick's expressions, I take it something big just happened, Ashley said. Her hair was messy from sleep, and David knew she probably wanted to shower but must have felt whatever was happening in here was of importance. Dee nodded. Yeah, just got the word. Good timing for you," she said as she quickly repeated the information she had just given David, Brick, and Trace. David spoke up after she repeated herself to catch Ashley up. "Do we know anything about the ride we are getting? What time it will be here?" he asked. Dee shifted her eyes over to David. "It's going to be a guy he knows. If I had to guess based off what I know about Dolph, it'll be a truck." "Like the one we were in on the DOE hit?" David asked. Dee shook her head. "Nah, it'll be something commercial. Dolph runs a truck depot. It's kind of a big risk for him, but it also has let him better manage how he gets operators and newspapers around to other parts of the organization." This made David flinch slightly. The idea of a commercial truck had its perks, but a lot of cons. What if the driver wasn't into the idea of carrying fugitives around that had already hit the DOE and now wanted to hit a freaking power plant? It would be a fast track to re-education on the low end of repercussions. Trace clearly felt the same way as he spoke up. Some doofy truck driver who drives for some commercial grade company is going to just cart us out of DC and into the Canadian Commonwealths with no issues? That is just asking to get sold out. His voice was covered in a layer of annoyance, like Dee was purposely testing the level of stupidity they all may be. Dolph ain't going to send an ordinary driver. Over the years he has controlled the truck depot. He has peppered in runners and operators who work strictly as drivers. They notice that they will be transporting delicate goods and they know the game is on. You won't have some run-of-the-mill driver. It'll be someone from the organization. "When's the driver and truck getting here?" asked David. Dee turned her attention back from Trace to David again. "Tonight, no solid time on that, but it will be dark. So, everyone should start packing and maybe learn the Canadian national anthem." She smiled. David knew this was a silly thing to say. After all, national anthems were no longer songs that held patriotic value, but were more or less just considered outdated songs. After joining the UCA, they adopted the UCA anthem, United Unions. The old anthems of all the old countries that now comprise the UCA were simply recorded in history as such. They spent the next couple of hours packing all the items they felt would be needed, trying to remember any and all the small important items required. Old Lady Nex offered David some ammo for his father's pistol, since it was the only gun he would be any good with at this point. Ashley took a shower almost immediately after the conversation at the table. Trace spent hours packing and checking every possible tech gadget he thought he may need. Brick just sat and drank. It didn't take David long to be ready and packed. The pain in his broken left hand was causing him major discomfort. So, he found his way over to Brick and took a few swigs, hoping to drink away the pain. It didn't help much. Then around 1:30 a.m., a truck was heard backing into the rear of the building. Much like with the DOE job, they waited a short time before the sound of banging came. Old Lady Nex unlocked the hatch and told the man on the other side he could open it. It sprang open a second later, and a fat man with a bushy beard stood there beside a commercial-grade truck. "Hey, how's it going?" he said with a thick Canadian accent. David's face lit up with a smile. He enjoyed listening to Canadians talk, always so happy-sounding, and he found himself hoping this guy would speak like Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas in that early 1980s comedy about booze. "Good," said Ashley with a smile. The man nodded at them with a smile. Well, old Dolph said this here address has some delicate cargo off to see him in Montreal. Have I come to the correct place?" the man said. "Yeah, you have, man. It's us," David said. The man smiled. "All righty then. I'm Chet. Fight the power, you know?" Chet said the last part not really in a yell but in a pretend higher-pitched voice with his fist pumped in the air. David laughed. He realized it had been so long since he had a real genuine laugh. "Cool man. I'm David. This is Ashley, Brick, and Trace. We want to fight the power too." They hopped into the back of the truck, which Chet closed shut. Inside, behind a line of soap, was a small section carved out for the four of them to hide in. They felt the engine of the truck start up, and then they were off towards the former landmass, once known as the Great White North of Canada.